Well, howdy ho there, folks. How are we doing today? Hopefully you're all doing absolutely peachy keen fantastic and full of the love of the Lord and having a nice time. Today I wanted to talk a little bit about the Chaos Gods, trying to make them good and why I like the idea of making them good, and better yet, why I'm doing that with the Chaos Gods rather than, say, the Emperor or something like that. So we're gonna go ahead and get started here. Hopefully you find my little video interesting. So yeah, let's go. Let's go to the first one. Woo. There we go. So first off, we got the Emperor here. He's rather large and circular in this instance. Also, look, I'm dressed like a witch hunter and I'm talking about chaos being kind of cool. That's funny. Anyway, so as you can see up here, we got a couple of things about the Emperor. The Emperor is kind of bad, real dumb. And I mean, I think those are pretty good reasons to ignore the Emperors. Really. But yeah, on a slightly more serious note, basically the Emperor is everything I don't want from a deity. He's overly controlling. He's basically saying his way or the highway is the only way to do things. He's also, you know, proven wrong on numerous occasions. He kind of is also the biggest enslaver ever. Also doesn't care about you. Also only wants to, you know, have his vision of humanity proceed into the future, nobody else's, and is, yeah, pretty dumb. I think the Horus Heresy did a really bad thing in the sense of making the Emperor so irredeemably stupid that it's almost impossible to figure out how he got followers in the first place. Like, really and truly, every time we found out something about the Emperor, it was some other detail that makes you go, oh, that's kind of dumb. I mean, I always think back to the time he was having a Magic the Gathering or a Yu-Gi-Oh duel. I like the idea of it being a Yu-Gi-Oh duel with Horus. And it's also just like, man, you can see like in the Outcast Dead and things like that he doesn't care about the average citizen, that even in the like shadow of the Imperial Palace, people were still living in immense poverty and their only job was to continue to fuel his war machine and his goals. He does not care about humanity, and no matter what they write about him saying, oh yes, I love my sons, oh I love humanity, I don't believe it for even a second. Someone who loves humanity does not act in the way he does. And I don't even think that you could argue necessity, because most of the time that doesn't even make sense. What was necessary about the way he treated Lorgar to basically make Lorgar betray him? What was necessary about any of that? Oh, turns out it wasn't. Also, massive genocide. Also, you know, betrayal of the Thunder Warriors. Also, you know, willing to basically toss anyone under the bus who doesn't, you know, isn't like super convenient for his plan at that time. And is also has to have a talking to by John Grammaticus and Elanius Pearson. And, yeah. Bad. The one thing I will say for the worshippers of the Emperor is that I do like their Catholic aesthetic. I like some of the aesthetic things they have, and I like that occasionally he still brings hope to people. And I will say that I think that the being that they're actually worshiping and is actually like coalescing in the warp is just not actually this guy. I think the Emperor is basically a separate entity from the deity we would know as the Emperor, which is also kind of an interesting idea because the deity of the Emperor appears to be at least somewhat more merciful and willing to come to your aid and willing to help you out and being more understanding, whereas this guy was just none of those things. And like I said, part of that is that he has to be deliberately written to be such a moron and such a bad guy. Otherwise, the Horus Heresy doesn't really make a whole lot of sense. So it's kind of just like a element of bad writing, and he's just a particularly not great image of that. I will also, this is just from an aesthetic point of view, I personally think him and the Custodes do not look great. Not my favorite. Sisters of Battle look cool, and a lot of the temples and churches and stuff look pretty neat, but this this guy himself, nah, not so much. Anyway, let's go on. What about the Omnissiah? And now you might be saying, wait, isn't the Emperor the Omnissiah? Well, no, not necessarily. I mean, he basically lies about being the Omnissiah and plants like those images there and like these ideas of prophecy there so that he can come and exploit them, kind of like they do in Dune, which is very interesting. Also another thing they took from Dune, just like the God Emperor idea itself. But I personally like the Omnissiah a bit more as a concept. Pretty neat. You get, you know, that peace through metal, although I would argue you're not conquering your emotions, you're just trying to quote unquote get rid of them. That's not the same thing. Oh, and the Emperor's a liar. I think the Dark Mechanicum is much more interesting, but the Cult Mechanicum have a lot of the same problems that, you know, the regular servants of the Emperor have, willing to sacrifice billions and trillions of lives to keep their machines running, engaging in slavery, you know, lobotomizing people, doing all kinds of horrible things to them, usually against their will. And, you know, you could argue that the people who do like the body modification stuff, and it is part of what they want, that's one thing. But then the others who are being forced into it, not so great, usually using a lot of evil stuff. I would argue you could probably do a lot of this without the evil, and I would almost argue it would probably be more effective. In fact, they're so evil it becomes like cartoonishly ineffective. But that's just the servants of the quote-unquote Omnissiah. I think it's interesting because the Omnissiah does seem to exist in some sense, but it's like much more abstract and is like quite possibly actually a much higher like view of like the spiritual truths of the 40k of the 41st millennium and 40k in general. So that's kind of interesting. I also really like the big mega science thing they got going on, and the idea of developing ideas and learning new things, even though a bunch of your guys would basically consider that heresy. But the fact that there are people who do still innovate and do cool things, and I mean, look guys, ultimately Belisarius Cawl did innovation, and those turned out pretty neat. I think the Primaris are pretty neat. So is a lot of the stuff he made. So he also seems to make a hovercraft, just a thing that the Imperium has again, so that's cool. He's also living for 10,000 years, although that part has always been... I don't really understand that part as much, but whatever. So I would say that these guys, if we're talking loyalists, would definitely at least be my better reach towards, I think, but they're still pretty bad overall. And I think that the Omnissiah is a very interesting concept and one that I like. I like the idea of using the Omnissiah as like converting it sort of to the idea of Brahman or like Shakti, you know, like the underlying energy that goes throughout the universe and like kind of does everything in the universe. I think that's kind of neat. So in that lens, I think we could go for the Adeptus Mechanicus. Ultimately, though, I would argue that as they are strictly speaking in canon, and the way their theology works strictly in canon, not great. And although it's better than the Imperium, it's not better by a lot. I think the constant deprecation of the flesh is kind of a silly thing. Okay, so now on to the next one, Khorne. Khorne is pretty interesting, I think, in a lot of different ways. I rather like some aspects of Khorne and rather dislike other aspects. I think from a tactics point of view, he's kind of a little bit more boring depending on what version of Khorne you play. If you play the version where they just charge forward and just charge forward and just charge forward, well, I would argue that orcs do that in a much more fun and interesting way. And constantly being angry does not sound particularly interesting to me. So when we're talking about the canon version of Khorne, while I can understand how Khorne, because of the freedom it can provide you from the horrible servants of the Corpse Emperor, who is not very nice, I can understand why you might want to go for Khorne. For me personally, the screaming and anger stuff just doesn't really feel like it's that great. I don't think getting angry feels that great. I always think about it the way the Buddha mentions it, which is that like anger is a poisoned arrow with a honey tip, and that like, you know, it can feel good in the moment, but ultimately it's bad for you over time, and it's going to poison you over time, you know, stuff like that. So that's part of the reason I'm not as big into corn. However, since we're doing slightly different versions of this and we're trying to make these better and good guys for the chaosness, we're going to talk about corn as a deity of honorable warfare and defense of the home. You could kind of do something like that, I think, if you want to still use corn but then make the pantheon better. I think corn can also be like righteous anger, you know, like if some injustice has been performed, you can use the element of corn and that anger to be like righteously angry and attempt to stop the issue that's prevalent. You know, sometimes it's like, oh, assassinating a president or something, or assassinating a bad dictator, or, you know, revolution can all be fueled by righteous anger and can lead to good things. They can also lead to bad things, but they can also lead to good things. You can also have the idea that, you know, you're not, you know, Korn doesn't want you to go in and kill a bunch of babies, even though, like, Korn says that he doesn't care from whence the blood flows. There is still, like, a hierarchy of things to where, like, Korn wants you to die in, like, righteous combat and fight in righteous combat. And, you know, there's also, like, this honor and freedom that comes with Korn that I think if you latch onto that aspect of Korn, you're going to get a much better result. Now, I'm also going to argue that pretty much all of the versions of the Chaos Gods being good guys, this version I'm describing is not canon. In canon, everything about Chaos is basically just evil and naturally leans towards corruption. I define the idea that you can use chaos in whatever way, and it's simply that the vast majority of people see the representations of chaos and decide to use it in a negative and evil way because that is the way their brains naturally interpret things around them. And they kind of go with that. I think that's a more interesting idea in that it's more that humanity is damning the warp, not the warp is damning humanity. And I think that's a pretty interesting way to go about it. So from a strictly canon point of view, just the idea of never-ending warfare and screaming, not really very appealing to me. The idea of being honorable warriors and like having a righteous anger and wanting to strike out and like down tyrants and stuff like that, that's a much more interesting version of Korn. That's the version of Korn I like. Not to mention he likes skulls, and skulls are pretty neat. I like skulls too. Then we got Zinch. Zinch used to be one of my favorites, but the thing that ended up happening to me was that the more I looked at Zinch in canon, what eventually occurred to me is that there's just not really all that much that's redeeming about him. He randomly throws Kairos Fate Weaver into a black hole. He's very likely to give you way more mutation. He's perfectly fine with other members of the Zinch cults, you know, messing up and messing you over and saying bad words about you behind your back and getting you kicked out of the party with cake on your face. And that's not very nice. We're not into that. But, you know, from a canon point of view, I wouldn't really want to go with Zinch. Even though it's pretty easy to get like a lot of sorcerer's power with him. I just feel like you're taking too many risks from the strictly canon version. But from our slightly altered version, Zinch can also be hope and ambition to like change things for the better. He can be, you know, the need for change in the universe, which is also very prevalent, and having him there can really help you to move forward, and you can use it as an entity that functions in that sort of way. I would argue that, you know, if you make it so that Zinch is more interested in the idea of change and progress than specifically the idea of scheming, then you have something better. Now, once again, I would argue that in that case, we're changing something kind of fundamental about Zinch that some people might not really like that. But you could also have that Zinch is like ever planning and always like one step ahead and can help you predict the future and help you change the future to something that you want it to be. and that could be an interesting way to go. I would just say be careful, because this one does want to trick you. Nurgle. I like Nurgle. I like a lot of things about Nurgle. He's big stinky. That's not something I necessarily like, but he does love you, and he's very cheerful. Now that's something I immediately get down with. I love that. I like being able to, you know, sing songs of praise and worship, and being able to get closer to your God and get all kinds of fun gifts, fun mutations, and things like that. And since Nurgle canonically cares about his followers, I would argue that if you're going to go down any of the paths, Nurgle is probably the one that's the least likely to get you in, like, trouble. I personally don't really want to go through the disease part, but I mean, it is just a default of the thing. As you go along the path, you will lose any of the pain that you would suffer from the diseases normally, so that's okay. Although there is apparently an initial buy-in of, like, suffering and things like that. Now, here's the other thing. Nurgle is also the god of stagnation. Now, in one hand, we have stagnation, which is things are going to rot and get worse over time, and like entropy and all that. But you also have the idea of there being peace, coming to terms with what the universe is. And, you know, this is kind of reminds me of this idea I've had, which is that each of the chaos gods kind of represent a different school of yoga, and also represent, like, you know, the four of the things that would really keep you back from prospering in yoga, which is kind of interesting. And I keep thinking of Nurgle as Raja Yoga, you know, meditation, being in that moment and being comfortable in that moment and understanding where things come from. And, like, some people point out that, like, Nurgle is kind of almost like a corrupted Buddha in a lot of ways, and I find that very interesting. In fact, I have this idea for a Maggotkin of Nurgle warband where they're kind of like dress up like Shaolin or Buddhist monks, and like maybe do meditation and stuff like that, but like meditate on like with the rot and things like that, and kind of become one with that like thing that goes through the whole of the universe. So rather than emptiness, they find entropies in all things, and they can kind of connect through all things with that. And I think that would be a pretty interesting idea. But ultimately, I think you can actually, it's pretty easy to make Nurgle an even better deity by just basically enhancing those elements of like peace and like acceptance and like becoming at peace with the state of the universe, but also like taking that joyous nature and like really expounding upon it. The beasts of Nurgles are also kind of like puppies in that school. And you know, you also have the Song of the Plague Bearers, so that's pretty cool if you want to sing a little ditty. I think that's neat anyway. And now we're going to get on to one which is my personal favorite, Slaanesh. Now, I will say in canon, the strictly speaking canon version of this, Slaanesh is probably one of the worst. I like the aesthetic of Slaanesh a good bit. I also like that it's female coded. I find it a little bit sexist that the only deity that has anything to do with passion or sex or is like commonly ascribed like emotions other than just like one's particular kind is, you know, the only female coded one. There's a lot of weird stuff with that, honestly. But the thing is, I like the idea of Slaanesh as a god of excess in anything. And one of the things I would have excess in is friendship. I'm currently working on this idea of my euphoric choir. Like, they wanted brotherhood and they wanted to feel like they had a family and stuff like that. Which, because I was reading the Fabius Bile books, and I saw that one of the things that the Third Legion keeps coming back to is that they want brotherhood. They want to do these things, but they can't trust each other because they're all like infected with this like need for perfection and this need to like be on top. So that's why I rather enjoy the idea of taking that and making it something more calm and good. It's an excess of emotion, of love, and this is part of the reason why I kind of associate Slaanesh with Bhakti. You take those emotions that you feel and you direct them towards God. And so what I was thinking is you could easily also have an excess of like wanting the betterment of those around you, having an excess of goodness rather than an excess of evil. Some people were like, well, I've seen several people, Pancreas No Works, and I think I remember Mr. Bones saying it as well when I was looking at a bunch of videos to get some extra opinions for this kind of stuff and see if there's anything that changed my mind. And they were kind of mentioning that like Slaanesh is the one that has like no real positive aspects, and then I my thought is, in canon, strictly speaking, it's excess, and I think it's always excess to, well, a fairly extreme amount. It's not a little bit of excess, it's a lot of excess. But one of the things that's very nice as well is that Slaanesh also has these things like embodiments of art, of literature, of music, and all these other things. The desire to improve oneself and to experience delights. You know, the ecstatic joy of divine transcendence is there in this, in a way. And, you know, like Samadhi is there in this, which I find very interesting. We can take Slaanesh and turn it into something very beautiful, I think, by just focusing on different elements. But once again, the actual canon version is not really like this. The canon version is just excess, and for some reason excess somehow always translates to very particular kinds of excess. And it's kind of weird to me that that's just the case. I think we can do better with a nicer version. I also like the color scheme and like the pink and like the idea of like being able to, you know, indulge in pleasure with some friends and indulge in like some delights of the flesh, if you wish, or to attain to a higher spiritual realm in which you're more specifically focusing on things like inner peace and conquering yourself. Your excess is an excess of peace and things like that. I think that's a fun idea, but I think that's also not what a lot of people come to Warhammer for. But for me personally, I just really like this. I think it's really fun. So that's kind of what I've been going with. But I also understand why people don't necessarily like it in canon. And that's not to say that I don't think the canon version has some good to it. I mean, like, it's supposed to be very alluring. It's supposed to be bringing you to good pleasures and things like that. And I think we see examples of people who are kind of more able to keep that in check rather than going full on running headlong and going, you know, crazy. But still, it is an interesting concept to think about, I think. Chaos Undivided. Now, Uriah is probably one of the things that I find very funny. TTS had like a whole episode of their If the Emperor Had a Text-to-Speech Device podcast, where the Uriah Olithair comes on and debates with the Emperor about the goodness of the Chaos Gods. And I was thinking about that in making this, and I think that Uriah makes some good points, although I also think that if we look at, like, how Chaos is represented in the Horus Heresy, like, specifically in, like, the last book, where there are literally, like, 4 cackling demons in the corner that don't even seem to have any, like, real motivation to do anything right, is kind of more what the canon version is. There can definitely be nuance, but I think that they've more come to the idea of like, no, it's just Mega Satan, which I think is kind of a boring way to approach Chaos. I think you can take Chaos and make it a benevolent thing if you twisted it the right way. But my thought is that if you're sticking to canon, once again, strictly speaking, I understand it's fueled by suffering and things like that. I'm just saying Chaos Undivided could be focused on something that is much grander. This idea of these 4 deities coming together to represent one ultimate deity that is ultimately benevolent and a force for change and good things in the universe of 40K, the galaxy that 40K takes place in. And that it's like a possibility for humanity to ascend in some sense. And I think that's like part of the really nice stuff there. I also really like Uriah and Lorgar. I'll say that. I also like it because you don't have to like stick to like defining your personality in one strict way. Part of the reason I like Slaanesh is because you can kind of approach Slaanesh in such a wide array of ways. But some of the other gods are kind of more limited. It feels like, but Chaos Undivided is very, unlimited. You can do it in all kinds of different ways. You can do it as basically like something that people turn to get freedom from the Imperium, or you can use it as something people enjoy for the understanding it gives them of the universe and the philosophy behind it, which I think is pretty neat. Anyway, in conclusion, in canon, the Chaos Gods are pretty mean, smelly, and even though there's some I like, there's definitely a lot of bad to most of them. even the minor ones and stuff like that. Personally, I like Slaanesh the most for her overall openness and the fact that you can follow her path and still like have nice things, and you can have excess of like good traits rather than bad traits, I think. Or and I like Nurgle because Nurgle is ultimately still a deity that is like very loving and wants to be nice to you. The other two I don't care about as much. And ultimately, I think we all kind of establish our own canon in our heads. This is just the kind of the canon I work with, is that the Chaos Gods can be nice, at least somewhat nicer. And that even if they're not always like that, you can have the ability to use chaos in a more positive way. That's just the way I like to approach things. And if you think that's terrible heresy, well, it probably is. But I love you anyway, and so does God, and God loves you big. Anyway, I hope that you all enjoyed this video, and I hope that you all have an absolutely wonderful day. And I hope that you know that I love you, and God loves you, and bye-bye, love you, bye. Have a great one, and enjoy this smooth jazz. Jazz! Yeah. Okay, bye, love you, bye. God loves you, bye. You know what would actually be a lot better is if we just all loved each other and worshiped God and gave each other hugs. Just saying.